this is Roger Green, host of the podcast still known for now as SurfingNASH Tsunami. Today we are offering 4 conversations from episode 35, in which Jörn Schattenberg, Louise, Campbell, and I joined together for the first time in a month to look back at the first half of 2023 and forward to the second half in terms of episodes and lessons. Plus, we have a vault episode from last November addressing the psychology of diet decision-making. This conversation starts with Louise Campbell discussing a recent study addressing the accuracy of the controlled attenuation parameter in FibroScan, a paper on which she was a co-author. This leads us to a broader discussion of the value of elastography and the challenges of making proper use of it. After this, I set up the first part of our conversation, which is dedicated to discussing major events from the first 7 months of 2023. Jörn Schattenberg starts by noting that the volume of new information keeps growing over time, but that one set of events that stands clear relates to the advancing of Resmetirom past the clinical trial stage to submission, which he hopes, we all hope, is a step on the way to approval. Jörn goes on to mention a second key event, the ending of the first stage of the nomenclature conference with the presentation of nomenclature results at June's EASL Congress. When Jörn concludes, the three of us spend the rest of the conversation discussing the importance of Resmetirom approval and some of the interesting data that emerged from some of the later releases of the MAESTRO trials. Reviewing this episode and the various conversations reminded me of how much information has become available already this year and what it portends in terms of future episodes and an ever-increasing explosion of new information about liver disease and drugs and tests, etc. It's quite a lot to digest. Very excited to consider, particularly going forward. So sit back, listen, learn, and when you're done, join the dialogue on our LinkedIn discussion group. If anybody has anything else that happened in the last week they'd like to share in terms of icebreaker, let's go ahead.
Louise Campbell.
Oh, I suppose if I have to jump in with something. We published an article I was a co-author on just before EASL, so it was sort of lost in the EASL thing, but it was about the accuracy of the controlled attenuation parameter in diagnosing hepatic fat content. And whilst a lot of the levels weren't dissimilar to a lot of the other trials utilised, we're the only study that did the FibroScan at the exact time that we did the biopsy and used the same area of the liver. So it was a direct comparison. The one thing for me that the team came up with is that for the lower grades of steatosis, you might want to readjust your BMI by 4.4 above, or the decibels per meter by 4.4 for every point above 25, and below you reduce. And it pulled it into the accuracy that we got in the biopsy. So when we talk about the accuracy of CAP, we do have to put it into context that most studies are done several weeks apart from a biopsy and the FibroScan, and we know that FibroScan can change drastically with patients' behaviour in a few weeks. So how accurate is it, or is it just not given the opportunity to be accurate? And I think with the world of metabolic health, proving the accuracy of CAP in real time against biopsy, it could be very useful, personally.
And not only proving it, but also getting the calibrations right, hey?
Yes.
We have guests on this podcast, not anybody who's here today, who are known in public speeches to refer to CAP in scatological terms. They had an R somewhere in it, and they say CAP is fill in the blank, because they cite studies that talk about how the numbers are stark, consistent, or reliable enough. That sounds like a real contribution.
Yeah, I think, and obviously this was a relatively small study, but Imperial, where the team are from, when we did it, we do our own percutaneous biopsies, so they're not sent off, they're not part of things, so they're done in the unit at the time. And I think this was the strength of this study, and I suppose the guys with nail NIT could use that sort of parameter to check whether or not it does work within the biopsy, because of all of those biopsies, you can add that simple algorithm plus 4.4 or reduce 4.4, just to see if it assisted steatosis accuracy, because I think that's what I'd like to see. Can we differentiate between diabetes and cardiac on steatosis levels? They might be different.
Okay, Jörn, so as one of the guys in nail NIT, does that make sense to you?
Jörn Schattenberg.
It absolutely does. It's a well-known observation that BMI matters for the ultrasound procedures, any ultrasound procedure, traditional ultrasound elastography. So I think that study was well performed in narrowing the time differences and getting more accurate numbers. I think in clinical practice, in the end, it gives us a direction. So the way I would use it in the future, Louise, and please comment because you've done so many scans and so many patients, is you get individual readings and you see if the patient improves or not, and you can use it to actually guide them a little bit. Now, there is an error margin, and a change of 10 decibels per meter in CAP might not mean a meaningful difference, but if you retest the patient over time, preferably by the same physician or nurse that takes the exam, you get a pretty robust idea of which way the patient goes.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I think the key thing is a patient or a person seeing a positive positive change to a positive behaviour change absolutely keeps that motivation going. That's one of the highlights of the year for me, is the more that we'll discuss today, is about this more accuracy about NITs to be able to track and help treat and motivate patients. Be able to be more accurate, particularly with our diabetes populations, our cardiovascular risks, and our liver steatosis risks, because you hear, and I've seen a few publications following the nomenclature where we still use the word benign for liver fat, and yet if you look at Sven's work, no fat in the liver is benign. It may not cause fibrosis for some, but it's not benign. So I think we need to get rid of words like that. Yeah, motivation, watching it, giving them a score on the door. It's the trajectory that counts, but also the reinforcement of a negative behaviour change with a negative or an increase in steatosis, again, is very motivating for people to change, because they always grin when they say, well, I didn't quite do that. Body language tells you just as much sometimes as fibrous can.
And the two together can be deadly, hey?
Oh, absolutely.
Louise, looking at you roughly in a time zone that I'm vaguely familiar with while we're talking about EASL reminds me that something happened for me at EASL twice that had never happened before. Two people walked up to me at different points and said, you don't know me, but I work with Louise Campbell at Imperial.
Apologies for anything you heard. Great team.
In fact, in one case, we wound up with the Quentin Anstey and the grapefruit story again. So
good one.
It was good. So with that, the format of this podcast can be really simple. We're each going to talk about one thing that happened so far this year, what we think was the most important thing of the year. I'll go last so that I can fill in what you all missed. It's of interest to me. And the biggest surprise of the year. And then we're going to talk about episodes over the next month. A couple Louise is doing, a couple I'm doing, and some things we'll be heading into the fall with. Biggest story first half of the year to you.
I'm happy to start if I get the room. 7 months of this year have passed. It's 1st of August. So thinking back, a lot of things happened. And thinking back to the podcast, the gang got together to share knowledge and exchange and discuss. It feels like the rate at which information is being developed in the field of MASLD or fatty liver disease, steatotic liver disease is even increasing. Going back to December 2022, there was the second phase 3 top-line result was released in a press release. So this is the story Resmetirom Madrigal press release in December, and we saw the data in June and in the general session of EASL. So this is clearly a big highlight of this year, and we've discussed the results in some depth in this podcast. Stephen came on to give his thoughts and ideas and revisit the efficacy and safety data of that, and actually detail a very sophisticated study program that will support the approval of this drug in my perception, namely an outcomes trial, long-term extensions, patients with cirrhosis, and supporting, a pathway to the first drug that will be eventually approved. And we can say that this started some time ago and first came out with a press release in December 2022, and now data being presented at EASL. Clearly one of the highlights for me. I mean, the second big thing that happened this year, and something we've discussed in extenso, and coming back to your comment on the name and the nomenclature potentially also affecting this podcast, is of course the discussion around metabolic associated fatty liver disease or metabolic dysfunction associated steatotic liver disease, and how this was all started. And also, again, don't want to revisit all pros and cons and how this developed, but clearly this is something moving forward where we're going to see a lot of momentum with regards to implementation, something that maybe wasn't perfect from the start, but coming out of the scientific discussions and the urgency to change something here, to not have an uncontrolled situation with multiple nomenclatures that have not been reached by consensus. I think this story is clearly one of the big stories of the year too.
So now that you took two, it means if I'm going last, I've got to find the fourth best story of the year. So strong work on that.
I was going to just comment quickly, and then you can give your perspective.
And that's fine. Let me go back to Resmetirom for a second, and then Louise, which is the two things have happened in Resmetirom since EASL, right? They finished their submission to FDA, and they received priority review breakthrough designation, which tells us that A, they're on track for the first part of 2024, and B, that it will go faster. It will go that quickly. So I think that's exciting that we're at less than a year from getting a final decision on that drug, hopefully an approval.
Absolutely. We haven't seen the full data set published as manuscript yet, but that should be happening soon is my expectation. And of course, safety is one of the critical issues for all of these drugs now, as we've learned, and we'll see even more data, I think, in a full manuscript that should be hopefully available soon.
Okay. Louise, thoughts on Resmetirom? We'll go back to nomenclature in a minute because I think that's a healthier discussion.
You've got to welcome it. I think we've been this close so many times before, and there's always been skepticism that we get over the line, and I think there's less skepticism and a lot more positivity about Resmetirom. It may not be the perfect drug in the future, and And there's already a lot of discussion about collaboration and multiple different drugs working together, but you've got to welcome it. And I think from the patient advocacy perspective, there has to be something approved shortly to prove that the bar that the FDA have set is actually achievable. Because if we fail again, then maybe we have to revisit that bar.
That's a very well-placed comment, Louise, and I agree. It was achieved before, so albeit histological improvement of fibrosis and NASH resolution is a tough target, it can be done by drugs using large phase 3 trials. So that's a good and very robust message that's being sent here. I'm always saying that the numbers we get here might not be the number of benefit we're actually achieving in a patient, because there's much more to improving, let's say, quality of life and long-term outcome than changing one stage of fibrosis at the time frame of, let's say, 52 weeks or even longer. So the numbers have to be interpreted over placebo, and the placebo response is not as high as you do see it with drug, and that to me tells the whole story. You can improve liver disease using those drugs.
Agreed. So one of the things that's captured me about the Resmetirom story in the last month or two has been thinking about inflammation and the importance of inflammation, which is not really tracked in any way as part of the approval process, right? But when we talk about things like quadrant pain and presenteeism and quality of life, you've got to believe that inflammation factors somewhere into that. And for Resmetirom, the inflammation numbers were higher than you would have predicted using the other metrics that were available, which tells us that there's more to the liver than we know, and there may in fact be more to THR beta than we know, but certainly we're not short of things to look at. But this does create at least one more avenue that I think might be really exciting over time.
To add into the mix, the other thing is the education that's going to have to go in before Resmetirom is approved into allied health physicians, and we're certainly a long way off that bar. And I'm not too sure where I can see that coming from. So there could be a time that this drug hits the general market and FDA approval, and we're not quite ready to deliver it. And I think that would be very frustrating from a patient perspective if the drug is out there and we really can't deliver it with the appropriate information and support. So that still concerns me, but it's always concerned me about where we're going. We've got great trials, and the best way to deliver often the patient support pathways is to really link in with how the best results were obtained.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded the conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. If you have suggestions for episodes you'd like to see us prepare in the fall, that would be the right way to send those to us as well. We'll be back next week, ideally with one of the conversation topics Louise Campbell discussed in conversation 4 of this episode. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.